From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples, bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price, by Louis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Shenandoah Newsma of Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, and by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and then finally by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. As always, if you need a mortgage, you need a loan, give Justin a call from pretty much anywhere in the country, and give him a holler. Find out what he and his team have to offer. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. All right. Well, it's been a busy week or so since the Boston College debacle. As I said, I wasn't sure what I'd do in terms of an episode before the next preview, but I am going to do a mailbag episode here, a sort of short episode before I get to the preview, which I'm going to record late on Thursday. Just have too much stuff before that to be able to do, but I'm going to try to get this one out so that it's available on Thursday, and then have the preview episode available on Friday. So the first comment here is actually one I'm going to take from one of the YouTube breakdowns. So this says, in a nutshell, our team got laughed at nationwide after 2 consecutive games, relying solely on transfer portal players to form the team, incessant griping about the ACC as if they are elite, but they aren't, griping about the snub, sort of justified but proven right with the lack of pride versus UGA. If FSU had built itself on recruited players and not taken them from other teams, they would not be so despised so much. It's also the reason they don't have the pride it takes to overcome adversity. Soon the recruits he did bring in will transfer out, and the dudes in the portal will stop coming. Last year was the best year Norvell will ever have, and the regression will be swift and last a long time. FSU will barely make a bowl game this year. Okay, dude. Go outside and touch grass. And yeah, there's not much to say to that, except that I disagree with basically a large portion of it, in the sense of like, oh, well, the lack of pride versus UGA. No, come on. The issue there is just that the best players on your team didn't play against UGA. And so it's not a matter of lack of pride. It's just a matter of, you've got an unprecedented situation. I mean, I think, again, I still remain frustrated by people who seem to regard this as something that, well, other teams would have handled this better. How do we know? Nobody else has ever been through that. And, I think that was one of the worst things that's ever been inflicted on a single program. So whatever. And this idea that, FSU's use of the transfer portal is, why they're despised so much. That's BS. Miami has more transfers right now than they took more transfers last year than Florida State did, and they've got more transfers and they're too deep than Florida State did. Nobody's talking about Miami like this. So, come on. Miami, Florida, that is. This is nonsense. And, the idea that this is, tied to, or that like the griping about the ACC is tied to these sorts of outcomes or whatever, that's also nonsense. The players aren't really impacted by that. That's off the field stuff. It's a whole different thing. And the idea that FSU will barely make a bowl game this year, that's possible. But I do think that, the next couple games are basically going to determine that, because this is a team, I still think that this is a team that has the talent that against this schedule, if it gets momentum and develops a little bit of confidence, suddenly looks very, very different. But to date, they've not been able to seize any momentum for the season, and that's, borne itself out on the field. I think against Memphis, if they're able to essentially stabilize themselves and find a way to essentially win that game with some convincing element, then this is a team that absolutely could go 10-2. I don't think they're going to go 10-2, but they could. And it's a team that could also very easily, if the wheels completely came off, go 4-8. I don't think they're going to go 4-8 either. But this is a team with right now a very wide delta between the ceiling and the floor at this point, and we're gonna find out here in the next couple of weeks whether or not they're able to gain what they need to and respond well enough to end up on the higher side of that. I would still bet above the 6.5 for this team against the schedule that they have, but we'll see. I don't think that they're going to miss a bowl. We'll see, but that's my view at this point. I think if you go back and look at the film, some things are really, really frustrating, but again, you can see a lot of the reasons that people thought this was going to be a really good team, including me coming into the year. So we'll see. All right. Next one is, it says, I think fans forget that the 2023 team was trailing Northern Alabama by 13 and then felt the need to run Jordan Travis to get a spark. I'm not saying I was betting we were watching the greatest upset in college football history unfold, but it was concerning and felt desperate in the moment that Jordan Travis needed to run, and we all know what happened after that. There's still a depressing belief I have that Florida State was waiting to pull that pin and have Jordan Travis run 12 to 15 times a game in the playoff. With that defense and Darrell Jackson coming in on certain downs, wanting to prove himself, who knows if that team had enough to win it all, but that's for another day. My point is this: Jacksonville State, Northern Alabama, and now Georgia Tech, as well as Boston College to an extent, felt like games in which the coaching staff came into each with too much hubris. But is hubris actually needed to be a good coach? It's just knowing how to balance the level of confidence. What I mean is you can't treat every game as the premier game because its staff and program doesn't have the time and resource, because the staff doesn't have the time and resources to dedicate treating each game as a playoff game. In theory, we would love to believe every game is as significant as the next, but is good coaching knowing how best to balance that, and it takes time? Jimbo may have had this problem as we lost to too many inferior opponents, and at the end he hyper-focused on athletic traits more than actual players. I just want to believe Norvell has finally learned what to do moving forward, because he now has a large enough sample size to avoid it if he chooses. Would love your thoughts, etc., etc. So I've said this before, and actually on the Inside Carolina podcast that I'm a part of for UNC, I've emphasized this at times there as well, that every coaching staff has to determine at the beginning of the year essentially which games are going to be schematically circled and which games are not. And you have to decide whether you're going to be a program that actually does that too. There are different ways of coaching. One way is to essentially try to coach every game exactly the same way. You're going to bring in the same amount of game planning and so on into every game. And the other is a little different from that. And my view is that if you want to win championships, if you want to be a championship level coach, you actually have to take a bit of a circled game mentality, because that raises the ceiling in the biggest games. So what I mean by that is that if you're a really good program, you're a really good football team, then a Florida State or an Alabama or a Georgia, basically a brand team. For a lot of the teams on your schedule, you are the Super Bowl. You are the opportunity for a coach to get a signature win. You're an opportunity for that team to do something that they think is a big deal. And you are that for all of those teams. So you have to play at a high level, but if you treat every game like that yourself, eventually you can't have players, and you can't schematically do it coaching wise. You can't quite have a big game mentality in every game. Players burn out. You're just not going to get your players at 100% every week. You can't. They burn out. What you can do is try to make sure that the level stays high enough in every game so that you don't get upset. That's an important point. But the bigger thing is that when it comes time to play against the teams that are your own size, right? The other brand teams, the other teams that have the players to compete with you, the question is, what do you have to compete there to win those games? And those are what I mentioned this with in the preview for the Georgia Tech game, that I thought Georgia Tech was going to treat that as a kitchen sink game. I mentioned the same thing with Georgia Tech. It's a kitchen sink game for them. They're going to bring in everything. Whereas for Florida State, you can't be a kitchen sink game in every game. What I mean by kitchen sink game is you're going to have all sorts of tendency breakers. You're going to have, whatever, you're going to empty the trick play bag, do all sorts of things necessary schematically to give yourself every advantage. Thing is, if you bring in your tendency breakers in every game, then you don't have the tendencies to break. So, this goes back to, you have to, in order to be a championship program, you have to be able to beat the teams that you should beat with your base stuff. You have to be able to execute your base stuff to such a level that against the teams where you have more talent, you're just going to execute so well that you beat them with that. And then when it comes time to play against those teams that are closer to your own size, those become your kitchen sink games. And then you bring that base stuff in, and then, you were coming downhill to defend against this. Oh, well, turns out we had this wrinkle developing this whole time. There goes the wheel, and, big play touchdown. It's that stuff that I'm talking about. And, I think there is some truth to the notion that you mentioned the Jacksonville State, Northern Alabama, Georgia Tech, Boston College, some of these games feeling like the coaching staff was not as prepared in those games. And I think there's some truth to that, because those were not kitchen sink games for Florida State. Those were games that needed to be win with your base stuff. And you have a grab bag of plays that you're bringing in every week. You have a grab bag of trick plays and so on, and they emptied that to some extent against Boston College, and it wasn't enough. But I do think that that the sense of, we're going to come in and we're going to work on this and we're going to keep plugging away at this because this is who we are, and we should be able to do this well enough to beat this team, that was there. And I do think that in each of those cases, the self-scout of what can we do as a team, I think was lacking, was wrong in some cases. So, or in some ways. So I do think that that's something that Norvell and staff are continuing to kind of figure out. And I don't think they've fully got it down yet in terms of how to handle some of these games that where really they're in the should win category, or you've got a significant advantage category, but the other team is dangerous enough where if you don't bring it, they can beat you. And that's kind of what you looked at here in these first two. All right, next one's from Merrill. Says, schematically, if you were Fuller, what would you try to do to try to at least put the Band-Aid on this run defense? Schematically, is there anything you can do besides getting out of the light box? Yeah, I think there are things, and I've been a little frustrated, or a lot frustrated, with what I've seen on some stuff in terms of what they've sat and tried to do, and kind of got bludgeoned. My general thought is, at a certain point, I come from the school of thought that if teams are going to run the football on you, and they're running the football and you're not able to stop it, then I'd rather go cover zero, go full, Gary Oldman in Leon the Professional.
Bring me everyone. What do you mean everyone?
Everyone!
Gary Oldman with, what would be a career performance for everybody else, but it's just Gary Oldman in that one. But that's my view. Look, if you're going to be that, if you're going to get bludgeoned in the run game, if you're going to give up, 11, 12 play drives because you just can't stop the run, then at a certain point, I'm not willing to do that. I'm willing to say, look, you're going to just have to, I'd rather have you beat me in one play than give me no shot to, make a play down the field with my secondary, or respond offensively. I want to go ahead and dictate to the offense. And my sense is that they've not dictated enough. If your linebackers aren't triggering well against the run, then blitz them all into specific gaps. Okay, take those gaps and bring those safeties down and play man-to-man coverage and nothing but that behind, and essentially say, you're going to have to beat my secondary to beat me. In my view, they didn't really do that in these games. They didn't decide, okay, fine, we're just going to go completely on an island with our corners, with our star, whatever, and we're gonna force you so that you can't run it just by having the extra 2 or 3 bodies in the box. I think they could have done that. Much harder to do, by the way, against Georgia Tech because of how fast they are on the outside, and you have the respect for Singleton and some of those guys that can fly. Against Boston College, I didn't think they had the receivers or the skill guys to cause you those big problems if you were going to do that. So, yeah, I think they could have done more of that. But, I tend to be a little bit more of a pressure-oriented, dictate on defense if at all possible, person anyway. All right. Next one is from Dave Blair. It says, obviously, this is a really disappointing start, not just from the standpoint of wins and losses, but for how incompetent FSU looks. The inability to complete basic concepts is going to rile up any true fan of the game when it's in your own backyard, especially when you're locked in a battle in the court of public opinion over your value as a brand. That said, let's think long term. If the season works out the way we feel it might, about which I'm kind of worried about them making a bowl, how does this affect the momentum for 2025 and 26, which projected to be more normal years based on the growth? Felt like this season was a bridge to the next step, and now that feels in jeopardy. Also, is it possible that those rumors of Mike losing some of the locker room after the snub held more weight than we thought? He's been so good at managing the locker room stuff so far. I thought the whispers were overblown. Now I'm wondering. Thanks for the work. Let's hope our guys can turn it around. So, first of all, taking that latter part first. Yes, I do think that and did think, I talked about this in December. I do think that Mike initially lost the locker room after the travesty and had to, basically find a way to win those guys back. Again, I said this back in December. This was going to be the hardest thing as a coach Mike Norvell's ever been through. Because everything that guy has preached is the work. Embrace the work. Eventually, you'll get what you deserve if you just embrace the work and let the results speak for themselves and so on. And those guys embraced the work, and then they got nothing. They got left out unjustly, and all of a sudden they're looking at him like, you lied to us. So, and, they're looking at him and going, well, if it's like that, if it's not about, if what we do as a team doesn't matter, then, I just want to get paid, whatever, it became, it's very easy psychologically for things to move that direction. And my impression is that they did. And, just look at some of the players who put their name into the transfer portal. One actually transferred out and then came back, and, others played hardball in negotiations, and things got much more me oriented after last season as those players started to say, okay, look, I'm going to get mine while I'm doing it, because it's not just about team, or it's not really about team, it's about me. And I think that's been a problem in this whole process. I think the other thing, though, and frankly, I thought Brendan Sonnone posted a sort of timeline about this that made its way around social media, and honestly, I think that was it was a good read. I was pretty surprised that some of that stuff was actually put out there for public consumption, because there were some things in there that some of it I'd known about, but had I'd been under the impression of, you don't talk about this. Like don't go anywhere. Like I'd been told, like, do not go anywhere with this. And some of that stuff was aired there. So I was a little bit surprised that, he either was essentially told he could go ahead with it, or felt the sense that it was time to go ahead and release some of that. No, and I'm not casting shade. I'm just, I knew some of those things, you know, previously, and was surprised to see how forthcoming that was. So kudos to him and to all that, and it's worth taking a look at that, because I think one of the things that whole discussion, or that his timeline makes clear, and I've felt all along, is that the travesty impacted both the transfer portal. Well, actually, three things: the transfer portal, recruiting, and player retention, in a way that was a major negative on all three parts. So essentially, they went from prepping hard for the playoff and focusing on that, to suddenly having to manage the players who have a much longer transfer portal window, and they're now suddenly thinking about whether they want to keep going or not, and whether they want to re-up and get a raise or not, or whatever. All of that stuff went from basically a week window where they would have had that after the playoff, to over a month. And it just completely changed the way that you've got to consider your player retention. And, like, you've got now a month where that guy's like, you know what, I think I want to get paid more, as opposed to, focusing on team goals for that next month, and then you just get a week. I think that was an enormous difference, that you essentially had a month where those players they had a chance to stew and to think about, how much more they wanted and how much more they deserved after a 13-0 regular season. And then you add to that after the travesty, the shine for being able to attract certain players, both in the recruiting side and in the transfer portal, was significantly diminished. I mean, I'd heard a couple things about, basically, as soon as they, a couple things that Sanone didn't actually go into, but I'm sure he knows about, and probably knows more than I do about on some of that. But where they basically were on the trail of guys that they thought they had a really good shot at, and after the travesty, and after the regular season finished, they were really confident that we got this guy, we're going to get this guy, and all of a sudden after that, just everything changed. And the way that other staffs are basically able to point to that and go, yeah, go there, and that's the kind of respect you're going to get. That's the kind of program that you're going to. That even if you go undefeated, everybody knows that you're inferior or whatever, that sort of thing. And it had impact. And then it had impact on their transfer portal, and who they were able to target, and when, and all of those things, and how much it was going to cost, and all of that stuff. So you combine all those things, and I remain convinced that I was told before last year that last year was a push your chips into the middle of the table year for Norvell, for the Battle's End, for the whole thing. Everything had built towards 2023. I said that going into last year. You can, anybody who wants to say, oh, well, you're just making this up now after the fact. I said that in the season preview last year. That this is a chips into the middle of the table season, going out and getting Keon Coleman and doing that. They felt like they had the last few pieces necessary to be able to challenge the best teams in the country. And they were going to do that while they had a senior quarterback, while they had a bunch of seniors and elite guys on that defense. They felt like they were just there, and they were going to push the chips to the middle of the table and take care of it. And then basically rebound a little bit this year, and then push the chips in 2025 and 26. That 24 was going to be a bit of a rebuilding year. They knew that. And that was kind of I think the plan. They were going to try to, you obviously try to win every game you can, but on the budget that they have and sort of the plan that they have, this was not going to be a push the chips into the middle of the table year as much. And then after the travesty, and then Saban retires, Norvell gets approached by Alabama, and I do wonder right now whether or not he kind of regrets making the decision that he did, because he had every opportunity to go to Alabama. And I wonder whether he's gone home a couple times going, it would have been a lot easier. Just wonder. But the thing is, after all that stuff happened, he was able to negotiate the budget for the roster up for this year and forward, that there's a certain floor that, this is what they're going to be at. And I mentioned that, going back in December when all this was going down, that was a big part of the negotiations. And I think that the sense of wrong and injustice that came in all of that caused them to reevaluate what kind of year it was going to be in 2024. I think there was a strong, okay, fine, let's run it back. And they weren't really built for that. Again, they were built for 2024 being a bit of a rebuild. And that was going to be fine after a playoff appearance and potentially more. And I think they ran into okay, fine, let's run it back. And the evaluation process to do that means that you're taking a little bit of a different approach to the transfer portal than you've taken in the past. And then again, as others have pointed out, I think they got surprised by the initial prices in the portal. They were ahead of the curve by about 3 years in the transfer portal. And everybody, who has tarred FSU as a transfer portal program at this point, you get Miami that in their recruiting pitch, Florida State's just a transfer portal program. You got more starters and you got more players in your two deep from the transfer portal than Florida State does. But Florida State was one of the first programs to really figure it out. And that is why they have the reputation that they do on this. They figured it out before everybody else did. They were skating to where the puck was going. And in consequence, they figured out the market and got a lot better before everybody else in terms of what they were able to get out of the portal. And then last year, I think other programs essentially caught up and looked at Florida State and were like, yo, it can be done this way, y'all. And all of a sudden, the market changed. The prices changed. Everything changed. And Florida State, who had been ahead of everybody and had been able to budget things one way, all of a sudden, early on with some of the early entries into the portal, they expected to be able to do it the way that they'd done it before, plus benefiting from the, look, we've got, proof of concept here on how this can work in our program. And then some of the top guys that they expected to go after just didn't come on board the way that they expected, partly because other programs just offered a lot more money. And, and those players expected a lot more money from Florida State. And so the combination of all that meant that this season, suddenly you've transitioned to a run it back season, and you're in a position where things aren't quite you're not able to get quite the players. You don't have a Keon Coleman coming in the portal. You don't have a Jared Verse available. Some of the things that you would have wanted to have if you were going to run it back, they're not available, but you're bringing in the best that you can. And in certain cases, what they did is, you could see this. A lot of the players that they brought in the portal were guys that they loved out of high school. And it's like, okay, our evaluation was, we wanted that guy so much in high school. We're just going to take him. And if it weren't for that, I don't know that they would have taken that guy if it were just based on what he had been at the prior place. Or some of the guys that they'd taken before, you take a Braden Fisk or a Jared Verse or whatever, you're banking on that guy's production at his prior spot. You take a Marvin Jones Jr., and you're banking on the evaluation you had on him out of high school. And maybe he just isn't what, you'd hoped he would be. So I think it's a whole combination of things. And yeah, I do think that, this, answering the first part of the question, going to that, I think this does dramatically impact the momentum for 25 and 26. I mean, this week, Florida State lost the bye week. The two best defensive line recruits both decommitted. That's a problem. When Javion Hilson, the edge, decommits, and it doesn't look like he's even leaving you as an option going forward, that hurts, because that's a position you've got to be able to recruit. and they've not recruited that great. And all of a sudden they got this, potential 5-star bell cow that is going to be, an early impact guy next year. And all of a sudden that guy's not going to be on your roster. That's a problem. You look forward to 25 and 26 and the ability to rebuild. And especially they were really transitioning early on in recruiting. It looked like they were going to be able to transition to finally being able to land the kind of players out of high school that they've needed to land. And all of a sudden, I think all of that momentum has kind of evaporated, and they're going to have to find a way to rebuild. And frankly, I think there's going to have to be some probable changes in terms of coaching staff to be able to bring some of those guys back into the fold, or to be able to attract some of the high school talent that you need, and even some portal talent that you're going to need. So we'll see, but tough stuff. Tough for Florida State moving forward. It's going to be very difficult for Norvell. But this is a get right week. You're playing against a really good Memphis team, and a team that knows a lot of what you like to do. Coaching staff that has had some experience with you. So you've got the opportunity against a team that you have more talent than, but that was true in the last couple of weeks. Are you going to be able to finally make that leap and gain a little bit of momentum? And look, you go on a 5-6 game streak where suddenly you're looking better each week, and you win those games, and at least you can regain a little bit of that momentum. But we'll see if they're able to do that. I wouldn't bet against Mike Norvell, but things are going to be tough moving forward, no doubt. All right, well, that's going to do it for this mailbag. Be back shortly with a preview of the Memphis game and a little bit more, probably a few more mailbag answers as well, but we'll go ahead and wrap there. Talk to y'all soon.
If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.